Is the tree of knowledge of good and evil the same as the law of God? That sounds bizarre. It sounds like that couldn't be the case at all, because the law is holy, it's righteous, it's good. How could that be associated with the first sin or the downfall of man in the Garden of Eden? Well, think about it. The law gives us the knowledge between good and evil. And so did that tree, the fruit of that tree. On the surface, it seems like a perplexing question. And we're going to talk about this in depth later on tonight here, just in a couple hours at 7:30 p.m. Central Time. This is Wednesday. We're going to talk about it and really go into it. But I do want to quickly show you some things and highlight some points before we do that. I'm going to go to my computer screen here. Here's a neat diagram I found from members.westnet.com.au, and it's titled The Gospel. And in the middle, you won't see my pointer, I apologize. I'm not able to get that for you. But in the middle, you see labeled you see this tree labeled the knowledge of good and evil. And at the base of the tree, you see the law. How could that be? Interesting. Well, and then around the tree, you have the serpent, or the accuser of our brethren. The accuser, when you violate God's law, Satan is standing there ready to accuse you. But I want to just go over here to the side column. All this other stuff on the right hand with the last Adam and the cross and being born again. We might go into that tonight. But I'm going to quickly go over to the left hand column of this diagram. You see there it says the tree and the law. There's a comparing and contrasting the two. Well, the tree of knowledge of good and evil caused Adam and Eve to be blind and naked. Well, John chapter 9 verse 41, verse 50, John chapter 9 verse 41 and John 15 verse 52, it talks about the law causing somebody to be blind and naked. The tree of knowledge of good and evil opened the eyes of Adam and Eve. And you see that in Genesis 3 verse 7. And the eyes of people are opened by the law in Romans 7 verse 13. Now this is one I want you to pay attention to. Genesis 2 verse 17, eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil brought death. Well, in Romans chapter 7 verse 9, the law is said to bring death as well. And there's a lot more said in here. Galatians 3 verse 24, the law was our schoolmaster. Romans 7:9 says, when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. This is a very fascinating topic. You know what? You'll have a hard time understanding much of Paul's writings, much of the New Testament, if you don't understand what this tree of knowledge of good and evil was. If you start interpreting it as other things, hey, you're going to be moving right off the path from the beginning, because the gospel is tied into, the foundation of the gospel is laid here in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. Real quickly, I'm going to go highlight some points from a website called The Kingdom Now. And it says that the tree of knowledge of good and evil, I'm going to highlight it here for you, was declared good, along with everything else he created in the garden. Genesis 1 verse 31. The law is good. Romans 7 verse 12. I know it might seem like these are contradictory statements, but they're not, and you will see tonight. Eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil brought a curse. Genesis 3:17. The law brings a curse. Galatians 3:10. How can the law bring a curse? Well, you'll see. The tree of knowledge of good and evil brought death. Genesis 2:17. The law brings death. 2 Corinthians 3 verse 17 and Romans 7 verses 5 and 10. The tree of knowledge of good and evil enlightened the eyes of Adam and Eve. Genesis 3:7. The law enlightens the eyes. Psalms 19, verse 8. The tree of knowledge of good and evil was forbidden by God to be eaten. Genesis 2:17. The law is forbidden for believers to be sought after. Well, that sounds strange. Well, it's not when we get into it. The tree of knowledge of good and evil makes one wise. Genesis 3:6. The law makes one wise. Psalms 119. The tree of knowledge of good and evil made Adam and Eve sin conscious. Genesis 3:7. The law brings consciousness of sins. Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 3. The law, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, caused Adam and Eve to hide themselves from God. Genesis 3:8. The law disconnects people from God. The tree of knowledge of good and evil brought fear to Adam and Eve. Genesis 3:10. Slavery to the law brings about fear. Romans 8, verse 5. And I could keep going on and read, and I don't think I'm going to do that today because we're going to go into this here later tonight. But anyways, it's a fascinating topic. It's so important. You know, this is one topic I've hardly heard at all taught anywhere. You would think that this would be the first teaching by pastors and ministers and ministries, is to understand what this tree of knowledge of good and evil was. I did a study a couple years back trying to figure this out. And some of you might have heard that, and I kind of came close in some respects to grasping it. But I had a problem. I could not correlate the law with this tree of knowledge of good and evil, even though they essentially, the result of the law and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or the fruits of it, are the same. With one little catch. We'll talk about that tonight. Anyways, hey, God bless you. Hope you enjoyed this short little message. Be sure to join us every Wednesday night at 7:30 p.m. Central Time for our live Bible discussions. And on Mondays, we post a line-by-line Bible study weekly as we go throughout the Bible. God bless you. Stay in His Word every single day so that you can be a Christian overcomer.